James Longstreet did not want to give the order. When the moment came on the afternoon of July 3, 1863, for the Confederate assault on Cemetery Ridge to begin, the assault that history would later fix permanently in memory as Pickett's charge, Longstreet found he could not make himself speak. General George Pickett rode up and asked whether the attack should proceed. Longstreet nodded once without a word. He turned his face away so Pickett would not see it. He wrote about it years later, in the careful but unrepentant prose of a man who had made peace with being blamed for things he argued against. He said he knew what was going to happen. He said he had known since the morning. He said he had told Robert E. Lee, in as direct language as a subordinate general could use with his commanding officer, exactly what was going to happen. Lee had listened to every word of it and chosen differently. What Longstreet told Lee on the morning of July 3 is one of the most dissected exchanges of the Civil War. Not because the precise words are in dispute, though they are, but because of what Longstreet was actually proposing, and because the argument he made has looked more correct with every decade that has passed since it was refused. The first 2 days at Gettysburg had not gone as the Confederacy needed them to go. July 1 had been a genuine Confederate tactical success. The Union 1st and 11th Corps were driven backward through the town and compressed onto the high ground south of Gettysburg, ground they had not chosen, ground they had not fortified, ground they occupied not by design but because they had nowhere else to go. The Confederate Army had the initiative and the momentum. Lee had arrived on the field late in the afternoon to find his men holding the town and the Union forces retreating uphill, and the question of whether to keep pressing, to deny the Union the night they needed to make that position formidable, had been answered with enough hesitation that the moment passed unused. By morning on July 2, George Meade had used those dark hours well. He was 3 days into command of the Army of the Potomac, having replaced Joseph Hooker on June 28 with no transition and no time to get his feet under him. He had inherited an army he did not fully know under circumstances that gave him no margin for error, and in the first 48 hours of Gettysburg he had handled it about as well as it could have been handled. Cemetery Ridge ran roughly north to south, anchored on the right at Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, anchored on the left at Little Round Top. The Union position, viewed from the Confederate lines across the shallow valley between the two armies, looked like a fishhook, curved, continuous, with interior lines that let Meade shift men from one point to another faster than Lee could move forces along the outside arc. It was good ground, defensively, and the men on it had spent the night making it better. Lee's plan for July 2 was to hit both flanks simultaneously. Longstreet would strike the Union left. Richard Ewell would assault Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill on the right. Simultaneous pressure at both ends would prevent Meade from pulling reserves from one flank to shore up the other. It was a reasonable plan executed with less coordination than it required. Ewell's attack came late. Longstreet's assault was delayed by an approach march that ran longer than anticipated across terrain that had not been properly scouted. When the fighting finally ignited in the late afternoon, it was as fierce as any in the war. The Peach Orchard, Devil's Den, Little Round Top, the Wheatfield, these were not near misses but genuine near disasters for the Union Army, moments when the Confederate assault cracked the line and was only sealed by reserve troops thrown in at the final possible instant. But the Union line held. When the fighting slowed on the evening of July 2, Meade's army still occupied Cemetery Ridge. The fishhook was intact. The Confederate Army had paid heavily for 2 days and was no closer to the decisive result Lee had come to Pennsylvania to achieve. This was the situation Lee faced when he gathered his commanders that night to plan the third day. His reasoning for what he decided deserves to be taken seriously, because Lee was not a careless commander and his confidence in the plan was not groundless. He had watched 2 days of fighting along the Union flanks, and he believed, based on what he had seen, that those flanks had been reinforced at the expense of the center. The reserves that sealed the breaches on July 2 had come from somewhere, and the most logical somewhere was the middle of the line. Lee concluded that the Union center, anchored around a grove of trees on Cemetery Ridge, was now the most vulnerable point in Meade's position. He also believed his artillery could change the calculus before the infantry moved. A concentrated bombardment, 150 guns or more, all directed at the same stretch of ridge, would silence the Union batteries and shake the infantry deeply enough that his assault divisions could cross the open ground and hit a line of men already rattled and suppressed. It was a reasonable theory. The artillery had performed well for the Confederacy in other engagements. There was no inherent reason it could not work here. And he believed in his army with a conviction that was not wishful but earned. The Army of Northern Virginia had done things in the previous 14 months that nothing in prior military experience had suggested were possible. They had turned flanks that should not have been turnable, attacked across ground that should have destroyed them, and survived pressure that should have broken them. Second Bull Run, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, these were not accidents. They were the product of soldiers welded together by 2 years of shared survival into something that transcended the normal limits of what infantry could accomplish. Lee's faith in those men rested on a foundation of evidence no reasonable observer could dismiss. But Longstreet was building his argument on a different kind of evidence entirely. He had been thinking about this problem, how the Army of Northern Virginia could win the war, not just individual battles, since before the Pennsylvania campaign was conceived. His preferred approach had never been to locate the enemy and attack them wherever they stood. It was to find or create ground where the enemy would have to attack you, and make them pay everything they had for every foot of it. He had been on the other side of that equation. He had stood on Mary's Heights at Fredericksburg in December 1862 and watched 6 consecutive waves of Union infantry come across the open plain below him and dissolve against his defensive line. 14,000 Federal soldiers crossed the Rappahannock and charged his position. Nearly 13,000 became casualties, the vast majority stopped well short of the stone wall at the base of the heights. The Confederate defenders suffered fewer than 2,000 casualties across the entire day. Longstreet had watched all of it from high ground. And he had understood in a way that few generals of his era fully absorbed what the rifle-musket and field entrenchments had done to the tactical math of the Civil War. The rifle-musket could kill a man at 400 yards with reasonable reliability. Defenders behind cover could load and fire 3 times faster than advancing infantry. The attacker, moving across open ground, absorbed fire from the moment he stepped off until the moment he either reached the defender's line or fell. The defender fired from cover and absorbed fire only if the attacker got close enough to return it effectively. After Fredericksburg, the question of who had the advantage in any given engagement was, for Longstreet, primarily a question of who was forced to move across open ground toward whom. He did not want to be the side moving. He had reinforced that conviction at Antietam, where he had held the Confederate right along the sunken road, a position that became one of the most devastating killing grounds of the entire war, not because of the genius of Confederate tactics but because Union soldiers were required to advance downhill across open ground toward men in a protected depression. He had reinforced it further by watching what happened to the Confederate assault at Malvern Hill. In July 1862, where Confederate infantry charged uphill against massed Union artillery and was repulsed with losses that served no purpose a reasonable general could identify. The lessons were accumulating. The Civil War was a fundamentally different kind of war from the one the generals on both sides had studied at West Point, and the thing that made it different, the accuracy and range of the rifle-musket, the speed with which men could throw up earthworks and abatis, favored the man who waited over the man who moved. What he told Lee on the morning of July 3 went beyond a simple objection to the charge. He was not just saying the plan was bad. He was saying there was a better plan available, and he had been saying it, in various forms, since before the Army left Virginia. Move south. Swing the Confederate right wing around the Union left flank, get between Meade's army and Washington, and find strong defensive ground. Make the Army of the Potomac, which had spent 2 years failing on offense, come forward and attack the Confederates on positions of their own choosing. The strategic logic was substantial. Meade had been in command for less than a week. He was working without the comfort of established authority, without the deep institutional loyalty of an army he had led through previous campaigns, without the political cushion that comes from a record of success. He was handling a crisis he had not created, on ground he had not selected, with no room for error. What Longstreet envisioned was not a retreat and not a withdrawal. It was a repositioning, an aggressive maneuver south and east that would place the Confederate Army on the roads between Gettysburg and Washington. The Confederates were already deep in Pennsylvania, and the psychological weight of that fact on the Union capital was enormous. A Confederate army not retreating but actually advancing toward the capital, finding high ground east of Gettysburg, throwing up field fortifications, daring Meade to come after them, would create a pressure that Meade, regardless of his own tactical judgment, could not resist. Lincoln had spent 2 years watching Confederate armies maneuver around the Army of the Potomac while the capital stayed vulnerable. This was precisely the nightmare scenario that made Washington ungovernable when it materialized. It would not be a problem Meade could choose to defer. It would be a crisis demanding immediate resolution, and resolving it would require attacking the Confederates where they waited. When that attack came, Longstreet intended to be behind prepared positions on ground he had chosen, which was exactly where he had been at Fredericksburg, and exactly where he had never wanted to leave. Lee heard all of this. He had heard parts of it before, in the weeks leading up to the campaign, during conversations about strategy that Longstreet would later characterize differently than Lee's supporters ever would. The argument had a history between them, and that history made the morning conversation harder, not easier. Lee told Longstreet the movement was not possible. The Confederate right was not positioned to execute a flanking march of that scale on short notice, in the presence of an alert enemy army, with supply lines already stretched. The army had been fighting for 2 days. A major repositioning of forces, the kind of sweeping arc around the Union left that Longstreet was describing, would take time the Confederacy did not have and would expose the army to dangers Lee was not willing to accept. There was also, though Lee did not say this in terms anyone recorded, the question of what the army had come to Pennsylvania to accomplish. The campaign had been conceived not merely as a raid but as a potential war-ending blow, a demonstration on northern soil that could crack Union political will, possibly attract European diplomatic recognition, force Lincoln into negotiations before the 1864 election made war policy the defining issue. A Confederate army repositioning defensively on Pennsylvania farmland was not that demonstration. A Confederate army that broke through Cemetery Ridge and destroyed the Army of the Potomac in its own backyard was. Lee needed a result, not a maneuver. He believed, genuinely, based on his read of 2 days of fighting, that the result was within reach. The enemy was there. He was going to strike him. That was the end of the discussion. Longstreet said later that he told Lee plainly, no 15,000 men ever arranged for battle could take that position under those conditions. Not across that ground. Not against those guns. Not against infantry that had spent 2 days on the ridge and had spent every hour since it arrived making the position stronger. He said Lee agreed it would be costly and held firm anyway, because he believed the artillery would change what Longstreet was describing. The bombardment that opened at approximately 1 in the afternoon on July 3 was the largest cannonade in the history of North America. Roughly 150 Confederate guns opened simultaneously against the Union position on Cemetery Ridge. The noise carried to Harrisburg. People in towns 15 miles away heard it. The ground shook along a front that stretched for 2 miles. It did not accomplish what the plan required. The Confederate guns, firing at distance across the valley, were shooting slightly high. The shells passed over the Union infantry on the ridge crest and detonated in the rear areas, killing horses, destroying supply wagons, wounding men far from the line, but not breaking the fighting men on the high ground who were about to be asked to hold it. When Union Artillery Chief Henry Hunt ordered his batteries to reduce their fire, the Confederate gunners read the silence as success. Hunt was conserving ammunition for what he knew was coming. The Confederate bombardment had not destroyed the Union guns. It had led the Confederate command to believe it had, and that belief was about to send 12,000 men into a trap that the artillery was supposed to have dismantled. The infantry stepped off from Seminary Ridge into the open in the early afternoon. There were approximately 12 to 13,000 of them across 3 divisions, Pickett's Virginians, Pettigrew's North Carolinians and Tennesseans, Trimble's men from multiple states. They dressed their lines, closed their intervals, and walked forward in formations that were impressive in their precision and appalling in what that precision was about to cost them. The men in those lines knew, at some level, what they were walking into. These were not fresh soldiers with no frame of reference. Most of them had been in the army for 2 years. They had seen what happened at Fredericksburg, at Antietam, at Cold Harbor's precursors and dozens of smaller fights where infantry went forward against prepared positions and paid the price. They had seen the open ground between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge, and they had eyes. Some of them wrote letters the night before. Some of them gave their personal effects to men who were not going on the assault. Some of them said nothing to anyone and kept their thoughts where they had learned to keep everything else, somewhere unreachable by the circumstances surrounding them. They dressed their lines and walked forward, because that was the order, and because they were the Army of Northern Virginia, and because the man who had asked them to do impossible things before had been right about enough of them that the habit of faith was not easily broken. 3/4 of a mile separated the Confederate starting position from the stone wall at the angle. There was no cover on that ground worth the name. The open farmland between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge offered nothing, no draws deep enough to shelter men from fire, no woodlots large enough to pause and regroup in, no rises in the earth that could shield a moving column from artillery cutting across the slope. It was a killing ground, and the Confederate formations had to walk through all of it before they reached anything they could fight back against. The Union guns opened at roughly 700 yards with solid shot and shell, tearing gaps in the approaching formations. The Confederate lines closed and kept moving. At 400 yards the guns switched to canister, tin cans packed with iron balls that turned each cannon into an enormous shotgun. At 300 yards the Union infantry opened musket fire. Men fell by the dozen with each volley. The Confederate formations that reached the stone wall, the ones that actually got to the angle, to the copse of trees, to the ground where the fighting became close enough that men used rifle butts and rocks, were a fraction of what had started across the field. A few hundred men broke through for perhaps 15 minutes before Union reserves sealed the breach. The men who made it over the wall were surrounded and taken or killed. The men behind them were still dying in the open ground they had not yet crossed. Of the roughly 12 to 13,000 who stepped off that afternoon, approximately half became casualties in less than an hour. Some regiments lost more than two-thirds of their strength. Every brigade commander in Pickett's division was killed or wounded. Every regimental commander in Pickett's division was killed or wounded. Pickett himself survived the afternoon in the condition of a man who has watched everything he was responsible for be destroyed in front of him without being able to stop it. Lee rode out to meet the survivors coming back across the field. He told them it was his fault. He said it to Pickett, to the officers who gathered around him, to the men walking past with their faces blank in the particular way that faces go blank after that kind of afternoon. He said it more than once, in the hours after the charge broke. It was an unusual thing for a commanding general to say publicly in any era, and it has been quoted ever since as testament to his character. It was also, by any honest accounting of July 3, accurate. Longstreet's proposed alternative was not a guarantee of anything. War does not deal in guarantees. The flanking movement south would have been a difficult operation, potentially dangerous, potentially intercepted. Meade might have responded in ways that defeated the maneuver before it was complete. Stuart's cavalry, still absent on its unauthorized ride around the Union Army, was precisely the force that would have been needed to screen a flanking march of that kind, and its absence on July 3 was a problem that Longstreet's plan could not fully solve any more than Lee's could. The Union Army had shown, at Gettysburg and elsewhere, that it could fight brilliantly in defense when given good ground and time to use it. There was no clean path available to the Army of Northern Virginia on the morning of July 3, 1863. There was only a choice between two difficult and dangerous options, one of which required the enemy to attack and one of which required attacking the enemy. But here is what it did not demand. It did not demand that 12,000 men walk 3/4 of a mile across open Pennsylvania farmland into prepared artillery and infantry positions in bright July sunlight. It did not require the deliberate destruction of the assault force as a functioning military unit. It did not cost the Army of Northern Virginia the accumulated offensive capacity that Pickett's charge consumed and never gave back. After Gettysburg, Lee's army in the East never again launched a sustained strategic offensive. He fought the remaining 2 years of the war responding to Union movements, defending Richmond, trying to hold what he had rather than taking what he needed. The tactical brilliance still appeared, the Wilderness, Cold Harbor, the long siege at Petersburg, but the strategic momentum was gone, and it did not return. The Confederacy's best chance to make the war too expensive for the Union to continue had passed across that open field on the afternoon of July 3, 1863. The post-war years were not kind to Longstreet's argument or to Longstreet himself. The lost cause interpretation of Confederate defeat required someone to carry the blame, someone other than Lee, other than the commanders who had performed poorly on July 2, other than the decision to fight at Gettysburg in the first place. Longstreet had committed two sins the lost cause writers could not forgive. He had argued against Pickett's charge before it happened, and after the war he had joined the Republican Party and maintained a public friendship with Ulysses Grant. Jubal Early, who had not distinguished himself at Gettysburg, led the post-war campaign against Longstreet's reputation with a ferocity that outlasted Early's actual military record. Longstreet was accused of being slow on July 2, insubordinate on July 3, and treacherous in the years that followed. The campaign worked in the short term. 4 decades, Longstreet's actual record, the man who held the Confederate line at Antietam when it was closest to collapse, who built the defensive position at Fredericksburg that made 6 Union assaults look futile, who Grant himself considered one of the most capable generals produced by either side, was buried under the accumulated weight of lost cause condemnation. History has spent the last several decades digging it back out. What no amount of post-war mythology could change was the reality of what happened on July 3, 1863. The charge failed precisely as Longstreet said it would. The men fell precisely as he predicted they would. The army that came back across that field was not the army that had crossed it going forward, and it never became that army again. Lee met the survivors with the words that confirmed everything his best general had told him hours before the first Confederate soldier stepped off from Seminary Ridge. Longstreet had said it clearly, on a July morning in Pennsylvania, while there was still time for the decision to be changed. He had said it because he had stood on enough ground under enough fire to know what he was looking at when he looked at Cemetery Ridge. He had said it because whatever his faults, and history has identified several, silence when he believed he was right was not among them. Lee listened. He considered. He chose otherwise. The argument between those two men ended at Seminary Ridge on the morning of July 3, 1863, but it has never really stopped. Every history of Gettysburg reopens it. Every analysis of Confederate strategy in the East returns to it. The conversation on that ridge is where the question of whether the Confederacy could have won its independence is most honestly confronted, not in the abstract, not in the rhetoric, but in the specific human reality of one general telling another that what he was about to do was going to fail, and the other general deciding to do it anyway. That conversation is still going on. Thank you for watching. Always like, share and subscribe to our channel.